They were told that surrender was worse than death, that the enemy would torture them, and that captivity would be hell. But for thousands of German soldiers captured during World War II, what awaited them across the Atlantic in the United States was something they never imagined. A prison life far better than the one they had known in their own country. As the tide of war turned in 1943 and 1944, German forces began to collapse on multiple fronts. Soldiers who once believed in Hitler's promise of an unstoppable Reich suddenly found themselves surrounded, out of ammunition, and with no choice but to raise their hands in surrender. For many of them, the shame was unbearable. They had been taught that capture meant humiliation and suffering. Some even whispered prayers, convinced that execution awaited them. At first, these prisoners were kept in temporary camps across North Africa, Italy, and France. Conditions there were harsh and crowded, but soon, the Allies faced a massive problem: too many prisoners. The solution was bold: ship them across the Atlantic to America. For the captured soldiers, this was the beginning of a surreal journey. Packed tightly on transport ships under heavy guard, they crossed the ocean with fear in their hearts. They expected cruelty. They expected starvation. What they found instead was structure, discipline, and even care. Meals were provided regularly, water was clean, and medical help was available. Some prisoners later admitted that this was the moment they began to doubt the endless stream of propaganda they had believed back in Germany. To understand their shock, you have to remember what prison life inside Germany was like. Military prisons there were brutal. A soldier who disobeyed orders or deserted could be locked away in conditions designed to break his spirit. Food was scarce, punishments were harsh, and prisoners were treated like numbers, not human beings. Even Allied soldiers held in German-run POW camps experienced malnutrition, overcrowding, and constant fear of punishment. It was a system built on intimidation, not dignity. So imagine the disbelief of German soldiers when, after weeks at sea, they stepped onto American soil and entered POW camps in the United States. Instead of dungeons, they saw neat wooden barracks. Instead of watery soup, they were given meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and even coffee. In some cases, the food was better than what American civilians were eating under rationing. Cigarettes were distributed. Clean clothes were provided. There was space to walk, fresh air to breathe, and even sports fields where they could play soccer or volleyball. One German soldier later confessed in his diary, "When we sat down for our first meal, we thought there had been a mistake. This could not be a prison. This wasn't generosity, it was the law." The United States followed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which laid out clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. America had a strategic reason too. If German soldiers were treated well, maybe captured American soldiers in Europe would be shown the same respect. But for the prisoners themselves, the comparison was personal and immediate. In Germany, prison life was defined by punishment. In America, prison life was defined by order, rules, and a surprising degree of humanity. They were still prisoners, yes. They had lost their freedom, but they had not lost their dignity. This contrast planted seeds of doubt in many German soldiers' minds. They had been raised to believe the enemy was barbaric. Yet here, in the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, they were allowed to write letters home, attend religious services, even take classes and learn new skills. Some worked on nearby farms, earning small wages, and were stunned when local American farmers treated them with kindness. One German officer later admitted, "We came here expecting hatred. Instead, we were treated as men." It was the first time many of us questioned what we had been told about America. For these prisoners, the war was over, but the battle inside their minds was just beginning. The comparison between life in a German prison and life in an American POW camp was so stark that it challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. And it was only the beginning of a transformation that would stay with them long after the war ended. They woke up each morning expecting to feel like prisoners, but life in American camps quickly proved to be unlike anything they imagined. The barracks were simple wooden buildings with rows of bunks, but they were clean, organized, and spacious compared to the cramped cells and cold stone walls they remembered from Germany. The guards were strict, yet they rarely resorted to violence. Rules existed, but they were predictable. For soldiers who had lived in the chaos of war and the fear of Nazi discipline, predictability itself felt like a strange kind of freedom. Meals were served at set times. The food wasn't luxurious, but it was plentiful. Meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, coffee, and even butter, things that many back in Germany could only dream of during the war. Cigarettes were distributed regularly, and for many, this simple comfort was proof that their captors did not see them as enemies to be destroyed, but as men to be managed. Some prisoners would joke among themselves that if this was captivity, then perhaps they had been better off losing the war. The most astonishing part for many German soldiers was the allowance of recreation. Camps had open fields where soccer, volleyball, and even boxing matches were organized. Instruments were made available, and some camps even had orchestras where prisoners could play music. Imagine the shock of a soldier who only weeks before had been dodging bullets on the battlefield, now kicking a ball across a grassy field in Texas or playing the violin in a makeshift orchestra hall. Education became another unexpected feature of camp life. German prisoners were allowed to attend classes, read books, and even study English. For many young soldiers, this was their first real exposure to a broader world beyond Nazi ideology. Some attended lectures given by American professors who volunteered at the camps. The knowledge they absorbed stayed with them long after the war, and in some cases, shaped their careers when they returned home. But it wasn't just inside the camps where life surprised them. America put many POWs to work, especially on farms and in local industries. With so many American men fighting overseas, there was a shortage of labor at home. German prisoners filled that gap. They picked cotton, harvested crops, repaired roads, and did all sorts of manual labor. For this, they were paid small wages, which they could spend at camp canteens to buy soap, snacks, or writing materials. It was during these work details that many German soldiers came face to face with ordinary American civilians. And this may have been the most shocking experience of all. Far from hatred or violence, many farmers and townspeople treated the prisoners with courtesy, sometimes even kindness. Some prisoners recalled being given extra food while working in the fields, or being spoken to politely by American women who had every reason to resent them. For men who had been told that Americans were ruthless savages, this kindness was disorienting. One prisoner later remembered, "We were told they would treat us like animals. Instead, they treated us better than our own officers ever did." Contrast this with Germany, where prison life was grim, especially for those suspected of disloyalty to the regime. A German soldier imprisoned for desertion or disobedience could expect humiliation, hunger, and physical abuse. Guards enforced discipline through fear, not fairness. There were no games, no music, no learning, only punishment and the slow erosion of human spirit. The difference between the two systems was as wide as the ocean the POWs had crossed. As months turned into years, the German prisoners in America began to adapt. They formed friendships, created routines, and found small ways to make life meaningful. Some carved wooden figurines. Others painted or wrote. Letters from home were allowed, and even though many were heavily censored, they gave the men a sense of connection to their families. For many, this was the first time they could stop and reflect, away from the chaos of war. Still, captivity was not freedom. They missed home. They worried about their families. And there were moments of tension, fights between prisoners, frustration with guards, or despair about when the war would finally end. But the overall comparison was undeniable. For German soldiers who had tasted both systems, American prison life felt more humane, more structured, and even, in a strange way, more hopeful. Perhaps the most profound impact came from the small details. In America, prisoners were allowed to attend church services freely. They could sing hymns, pray, and speak to chaplains. In Germany, religion often took a back seat to loyalty to the state, and suspicion of disloyalty was everywhere. Here, in captivity, they rediscovered a sense of spirituality. Slowly, the idea of America began to change in their minds. It was no longer just the enemy. It was a place where fairness seemed possible, where even prisoners were treated with a measure of respect. This realization didn't erase their loyalty to their homeland, but it planted seeds of doubt about the system they had served. By the time many of these prisoners were released years later, they carried with them not just memories of war, but of this extraordinary comparison. Their time in America had shown them that there was another way to live, another way to govern, another way to treat human beings. And when they returned to Germany, broken and devastated by war, those lessons shaped how they rebuilt their lives. For now, though, they remained behind the fences of American camps. But even within those fences, they had discovered something powerful, that prison life could be not just punishment, but also a strange kind of education, a doorway into a world they never expected to see. At first, life inside the American camps seemed almost too good to be true, and many prisoners suspected it was all part of a trick. Some whispered that the Americans were trying to soften them up, to turn them against Germany. Old loyalties ran deep, and among the thousands of captured soldiers were men who still believed firmly in Hitler's cause. These men saw kindness not as generosity, but as an enemy's strategy. This created divisions inside the camps. There were prisoners who quietly began to question everything they had been taught, and there were others who refused to doubt, who clung to Nazi ideology as if it were the last thing keeping them standing. Tension grew between these groups. Sometimes it led to arguments, sometimes to violence. In some camps, hardline Nazis formed secret groups to enforce loyalty. If a prisoner openly praised American treatment or criticized Hitler, he risked being labeled a traitor. There were cases where prisoners were beaten by their own comrades, even killed, because they were suspected of betraying the Reich. The Americans quickly realized they couldn't simply leave all German prisoners mixed together. They began separating the hardliners from the moderates, isolating those who tried to intimidate others. But even with these measures, the camps reflected the larger war still raging in the prisoners' minds. The irony was striking. Inside the barbed wire, the Americans didn't have to punish or threaten the men. The prisoners policed each other. Loyalty to Nazi ideology became a shadow government within the camps, and every man had to choose where he stood. Would he cling to the old world of propaganda, or open his eyes to the reality around him? For many, the cracks in their beliefs came slowly. It was in small, quiet moments, like reading a book from the camp library that spoke of democracy, or listening to a radio broadcast about freedom of speech, or watching an American farmer treat them with simple respect while they worked in the fields. These experiences stacked up, and before long, they began to outweigh the slogans they had memorized back home. One prisoner later described it as living in two worlds at once. Inside his mind, he could still hear the voice of Hitler declaring that the German people were superior, destined to rule. But outside the window of his barracks, he saw American guards who treated him fairly, farmers who handed him water, and children who waved at him from a distance without fear. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. There was also the psychological weight of distance. Being thousands of miles away from Germany meant that the Nazi regime had no direct power over them anymore. Yes, there were fellow prisoners who enforced loyalty, but the iron grip of the Gestapo and the SS was far behind them. For the first time, many soldiers could think without the constant threat of punishment. And thinking freely led to dangerous questions. Why had they been told America was weak when its industry and farms seemed endless? Why had they been told Americans were cruel when their treatment said otherwise? Why had they been promised victory when they now sat behind barbed wire on foreign soil? Not every prisoner accepted these thoughts. Some hardened their hearts, insisting it was all temporary, that Germany would rise again. But others felt an undeniable shift. What they saw and experienced in America was rewriting the story of the war in their minds. The prison life comparison was no longer just about food or barracks. It had become a comparison of entire systems: fear versus freedom, cruelty versus fairness, blind loyalty versus open questioning. For the Americans, this transformation was not accidental. Behind the scenes, they ran re-education programs, carefully designed to expose prisoners to democratic ideas without forcing them. They allowed lectures, films, and discussions that presented another way of thinking. It was subtle but effective. A soldier who once saw America as the enemy began to see it as a country where ordinary people lived in comfort and security without constant surveillance or propaganda. At the same time, there were emotional struggles. Captivity was not easy. Letters from home carried news of bombings, hunger, and death. Some men learned that their families had lost everything, that their cities had been reduced to rubble. They sat in their barracks at night, writing replies they weren't sure would ever reach their loved ones, their hearts torn between the strange safety of captivity and the devastation of home. Some prisoners broke down under the weight of guilt. They asked themselves, "Why am I here, safe and fed, while my family starves back in Germany?" For these men, American kindness was both a blessing and a torment. They appreciated the food, the shelter, the treatment, but they couldn't shake the thought that their survival came at the cost of abandoning their homeland. This mix of gratitude, guilt, loyalty, and doubt created an atmosphere unlike anything the guards expected. The camps were not simply prisons. They were arenas where entire belief systems clashed. In Germany, prison meant punishment. In America, prison became a place of transformation, sometimes slow, sometimes painful, but always profound. One former prisoner would later sum it up in a few words: "We came to America as enemies. We left with questions." Those questions would only grow louder as the war dragged on. For now, though, the German soldiers lived between two realities: the old world they had left behind, and the new world they were beginning to see with their own eyes. When the gates opened and groups of German prisoners were marched out under guard, many expected to face harsh labor, backbreaking tasks designed to humiliate them. Instead, what they found shocked them once again. They were taken to farms, orchards, sawmills, and factories, not as slaves, but as workers. America had lost millions of men to the battlefields overseas, and labor was in short supply. The prisoners became part of the solution, filling gaps in the workforce, picking crops, repairing fences, chopping wood, and sometimes even assisting in construction. At first, suspicion filled the air. Local civilians eyed the German soldiers with a mix of curiosity and unease. These were the same men who had marched under Hitler's banner, who had fought against American sons, and now they were here, wearing faded uniforms with PW stenciled on their backs. But as days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. Farmers realized the prisoners worked hard, and the prisoners realized the farmers treated them fairly. Slowly, walls of fear began to crumble. For the German POWs, this was a revelation. They had been told that America was a land of selfish, greedy people, a nation of chaos and corruption. Yet here, in the fields of Texas, the orchards of California, and the plains of Kansas, they saw ordinary men and women living in a way that was both simple and free. Farmers gave them water when the sun was high, offered extra bread or fruit when rations allowed, and sometimes even shared conversations in broken English or German. Some prisoners later recalled that it was during these work details that they truly began to see America as something more than the enemy. They saw houses with radios playing music in the evenings, families gathering at the dinner table, children running barefoot through fields without fear. It was not propaganda. It was life, ordinary, free, and deeply human. The contrast with Germany's prison system was impossible to ignore. Back home, if a soldier was imprisoned for disobedience or desertion, labor was punishment. It was carried out under brutal conditions, often in mines or quarries, with little food and constant threats of violence. Work was meant to break a man, not sustain him. Here in America, labor was different. It was structured, yes, but it was productive. The prisoners were paid small wages, often in canteen coupons, and allowed to spend them on simple pleasures: soap, snacks, or cigarettes. They weren't being broken. They were being kept busy, useful, even respected in small ways. Perhaps the most shocking thing for the prisoners was the kindness of strangers. Stories spread among the camps of American families who offered cold drinks to POWs working in the summer heat, or who treated them like human beings rather than monsters. One prisoner remembered being handed an apple by a farmer's wife and feeling more confused than grateful. "She looked at me as if I were just a man," he later wrote, "not an enemy." Of course, not every encounter was warm. There were Americans who despised the idea of enemy soldiers being treated well, who had lost brothers or sons to the war and could not bring themselves to look at these men without anger. But overall, the treatment was far gentler than the prisoners ever expected. And it was this everyday decency, this quiet fairness, that left the deepest mark. Inside the camps, the prisoners talked endlessly about what they saw outside. They compared it not only to German prisons, but to life in Germany itself. Some admitted that the average American farmer seemed to live better than many German officers. The houses were sturdier, the food more abundant, the clothes more comfortable. This realization cut deep. How could a nation they had been taught to despise have built such prosperity? How could decadent America provide more stability and freedom than the Reich, which had promised them glory? The more they worked, the clearer the comparison became. Prison in America was not a dungeon, not a place designed to erase dignity. It was a controlled life, yes, but also one that offered fairness, routine, and even opportunities. Germany's prisons, by contrast, symbolized fear, punishment, and suppression. The POWs saw firsthand that America's strength was not just its factories or armies, but its way of life. These work programs also created unexpected bonds. Some prisoners remembered friendly competitions with American farmhands, trying to pick cotton faster or stack bales higher. Others recalled learning bits of English from local children who laughed at their accents. These were small moments, almost ordinary, yet they carried enormous meaning. They showed the prisoners a world beyond propaganda, a world where enemies could meet as people. Not every prisoner welcomed this realization. For some, the kindness of Americans was unsettling, even frightening. It made them question everything they had believed, and that questioning felt like betrayal. These men clung tighter to Nazi loyalty, accusing others of weakness. But even they could not deny the difference between what they saw in America and what they had known in Germany. By the time the sun set and the prisoners were marched back into camp, they carried with them more than tired muscles. They carried images of a society that worked differently, that lived differently, and that treated even its captives with a strange sense of humanity. Night after night, in the barracks, these comparisons turned into quiet conversations. Some men admitted openly that America was not the monster they had been taught to fear. Others resisted, insisting that it was all a trick. But the seed was planted, and it grew stronger with every day of work, every handshake, every shared meal. For many, this period of labor was the most transformative part of captivity. It wasn't lectures or pamphlets that changed their minds. It was the simple, human experience of working alongside ordinary Americans. And as they compared this with the brutal prison life of their homeland, the truth became impossible to ignore. The enemy they had been taught to hate was offering them a glimpse of a freer, more dignified world. At first, the days in America felt strangely disconnected from the war raging across the oceans. Inside the camps, the fences, barracks, and routines created a world of their own. But slowly, letters from home began to arrive, carrying fragments of a very different reality. Families wrote about bombings that destroyed entire cities, food shortages that left children hungry, and neighbors who had vanished in the night. The prisoners read these letters with trembling hands, their hearts torn between relief that they were safe and guilt that they were far from the suffering of their loved ones. For many, this was the hardest part of captivity. They ate 3 meals a day, had clean clothes, and even played soccer under the sun, while their families back in Germany queued for hours to buy bread or huddled in basements as air raid sirens screamed above. Some soldiers confessed privately that they felt ashamed of their safety, as if being well fed behind barbed wire was a betrayal of the people they had sworn to protect. The contrast between American captivity and German reality could not have been more stark. At home, civilians faced shortages, bombings, and fear of the Gestapo. In Germany's own prisons, punishment was harsh, food scarce, and survival uncertain. Yet here in America, prisoners were not only surviving but, in many cases, thriving compared to their homeland. This gap became a constant subject of whispered conversations in the barracks. Some men admitted openly, "We are prisoners, but we live better than our families." As the war dragged into 1944 and 1945, the tone of the letters shifted. Reports of destruction became more desperate. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were reduced to rubble. Families were split apart, some evacuated to the countryside, others lost to the chaos of war. The prisoners began to realize that the Germany they had left behind was disappearing piece by piece. American guards sometimes shared newspapers, and those who could read English caught glimpses of headlines announcing Allied victories. Even those who could not read the words could see the maps, the arrows showing Allied forces pushing deeper into Europe. Rumors spread quickly. Paris has fallen. The Russians are in Warsaw. The Americans have crossed the Rhine. Each rumor chipped away at the hope that Germany might still win. Inside the camps, this created emotional chaos. Some men clung stubbornly to the belief that Hitler had a secret weapon, that a miracle would turn the war. Others sank into silence, realizing that their families might be suffering for a war that could no longer be won. For the first time, many began to admit, if only to themselves, that surrender had saved their lives. The prison life comparison became more than physical comfort. It became a mirror of two worlds. On one side, Germany's prisons and cities collapsing into hunger, ruin, and fear. On the other side, America's camps offering stability, routine, and even dignity. The irony was bitter. They had fought to defend their homeland, yet captivity in a foreign land offered them more safety than freedom in Germany itself. This realization deepened when news of atrocities began to surface. Some American officials deliberately exposed POWs to reports of concentration camps and civilian massacres. At first, many refused to believe it. They insisted it was propaganda, lies meant to break their spirit. But as evidence grew undeniable, a different kind of silence fell across the camps. Men stared at the ground, unwilling to speak, ashamed to imagine what their government had done in their name. The psychological burden was enormous. A man who had once believed he was fighting for honor now wondered if he had been fighting for a lie. Some prisoners wrestled with guilt so heavy it haunted them for years after the war. Others defended themselves with denial, refusing to accept the truth. But no matter how they processed it, the comparison between prison life in America and the reality of Germany became almost unbearable. Meanwhile, daily life in the camps continued. There were still soccer games, work details, and classes. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The prisoners were no longer simply waiting for release. They were waiting to see what was left of their homeland. Would there be a Germany to return to? Would their families survive? Would they even recognize the streets they had once called home? When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the camps exploded with mixed emotions. Some men wept openly, mourning the fall of their nation. Others felt only relief, knowing that the nightmare was finally over. For many, the moment was surreal. They were still behind fences, still prisoners, yet they knew they were among the luckiest Germans alive. Their captivity had saved them from the firestorm that had consumed their homeland. Now the comparison reached its sharpest edge. In Germany, prisons were overflowing with starving men, civilians were scraping for scraps, and cities lay in ashes. In America, even as prisoners, they had food, shelter, education, and safety. The irony was inescapable. For some, it became unbearable. For others, it became a strange kind of gratitude. One prisoner wrote years later, "I came to America as an enemy, but I survived because of its fairness. My family did not survive Germany. Prison saved me." It was a truth many of them carried for the rest of their lives, that the prison life they had feared turned out to be more humane than the life they had left behind. When the war finally ended, the prisoners expected to be sent home quickly. They dreamed of stepping off ships, walking back into their towns, and seeing their families again. But the reality was far more complicated. The war might have ended, but the process of sending millions of German prisoners back across the ocean was slow, tangled, and uncertain. Many were moved from American camps to Europe before they were released. For some, this meant months or even years of waiting. In the meantime, life inside the camps continued much as before: soccer matches, classes, work details, but now with a different atmosphere. The war was over. They were no longer enemy soldiers. They were defeated men waiting for their fate. As the weeks turned into months, impatience grew. Some prisoners began to resent their continued captivity, wondering why they were still held when the fighting had stopped. But at the same time, Many realized that the camp fences had also become a kind of protection. Inside, there was food, shelter, and order. Outside, in the ruins of Germany, there was hunger, rubble, and chaos. The idea of returning home filled them with both hope and dread. When the first groups were finally sent back across the Atlantic, the journey was filled with nervous anticipation. Men stood on the decks of ships, staring out at the waves, imagining the moment they would see their homeland again. But what awaited them was not the Germany they had left. Cities they once knew were flattened. Streets were unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods had vanished under firestorms of bombs. Families had been scattered, some lost forever. The shock of return was overwhelming. For many, captivity in America had been easier than freedom in post-war Germany. Behind the barbed wire, they had been fed. Now, in their own country, they saw children with hollow eyes and women trading heirlooms for a loaf of bread. Some prisoners admitted quietly that they missed the camps, not the fences or the guards, but the stability, the certainty of survival. This comparison haunted them. They had spent years dreading captivity, only to discover that captivity had kept them alive. They had believed German propaganda about American cruelty, only to discover that America had treated them with fairness, sometimes even kindness. Now, as they walked through the ruins of their homeland, they couldn't help but ask themselves, who had really betrayed them? The memories of American prison life became part of their rebuilding process. Some former POWs used the skills they had learned in the camps, English, carpentry, farming techniques, to rebuild their lives. Others carried with them a sense of perspective, a quiet knowledge that the world outside Germany was different, freer, more humane than they had been told. Of course, not everyone admitted this openly. In the first years after the war, bitterness and shame ran deep. Many former soldiers kept silent about their experiences, unwilling to speak of the kindness they had received from the enemy. But within themselves, the comparison remained. And for many, it shaped the way they saw the future. Some even returned to America later in life, drawn by memories of a place that had shown them humanity in the darkest time of their lives. They visited the farms where they had worked, shook hands with the families who had once given them water or bread, and thanked the guards who had treated them with dignity. These reunions were quiet, personal, but they spoke volumes about the power of those years in captivity. The prison life comparison never left them. In Germany, prison had been punishment, fear, hunger, and humiliation. In America, prison had been control, yes, but also dignity, fairness, and even unexpected opportunities. This realization shaped not only their memories but, in many cases, their politics and beliefs in the decades that followed. Some former POWs later admitted that their time in American camps had planted the first seeds of doubt about dictatorship. They had seen that order and prosperity could exist without terror, that freedom could coexist with discipline, that dignity could survive even in captivity. These lessons, carried home silently, became part of Germany's slow transformation after the war. For the rest of their lives, many German veterans would compare the two systems. They would sit in quiet moments, remembering the fear of German prisons, the propaganda of the Reich, and then the surprising fairness of American captivity. And they would tell their children or grandchildren a simple truth, that even in war, humanity can appear in unexpected places. The irony was unforgettable. They had marched into battle convinced of their superiority, certain that they were fighting for a cause worth dying for. They had been captured expecting suffering, humiliation, and despair. Instead, they discovered that their enemies' prisons offered more hope than their homeland's promises. For some, this truth was painful. For others, it was liberating. But for all, it was a memory they carried until their last days, that in the darkest war the world had ever known, prison life in America revealed a comparison they could never forget. For many German prisoners, the war did not truly end when they stepped off the transport ships and walked into the ruins of their homeland. The memories of captivity stayed with them, woven into their identities, shaping how they saw both Germany and America for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it openly, while others stayed silent, but almost all carried with them the haunting comparison between two worlds. In the first years after the war, silence was often easier. Germany lay in ruins, families were grieving, and few wanted to hear about the strange decency of enemy prison camps. Returning soldiers faced suspicion, questions about their loyalty, and shame about the war itself. To stand up and say, life in American captivity was humane, even better than life back home, felt like a betrayal. So many former prisoners kept their memories locked inside. They focused instead on rebuilding, on finding food for their families, on clearing rubble and creating some kind of normal life from the ashes. But the memories didn't disappear. They resurfaced in quiet conversations, in bedtime stories to children, in the private reflections of men who had seen both sides of the war. Some told their sons and daughters, "We were prisoners, but we were treated with dignity." Others said less, but carried with them an unspoken respect for the system that had given them fairness in their darkest years. As time passed and Germany recovered, more former POWs began to speak. By the 1950s and 1960s, memoirs and interviews revealed stories of soccer games, music lessons, friendly farmers, and full plates of food behind barbed wire. These stories astonished younger generations, who could hardly believe that prisoners of war had lived better in America than civilians had in Germany. The prison life comparison became part of Germany's reflection on its own past. It wasn't only about food or barracks. It was about systems, about values, about the way nations treated people when they had absolute power over them. Germany's own prisons during the war symbolized punishment, fear, and cruelty. America's camps, though still captivity, symbolized fairness, order, and even unexpected humanity. The lesson was clear: dignity mattered, even for enemies. This realization shaped attitudes toward democracy. Many former prisoners admitted privately that their first true exposure to democratic values came not from classrooms or speeches, but from the everyday life they saw in America. The freedom of ordinary civilians, the respect for rules without terror, the treatment of prisoners as men rather than tools, all of this showed them a different way of life. When they returned to Germany and helped rebuild their society, these impressions influenced their beliefs. Some even said that their time in American camps prepared them to accept, and even embrace, the democratic system that emerged in West Germany. Of course, not every prisoner felt gratitude. Some remained bitter until the end of their lives, refusing to believe that America had treated them fairly. They clung to the idea that captivity had been an insult, that the enemy could never be trusted. But even they could not deny the difference between what they experienced in America and what they had seen at home. Over the decades, many former POWs returned to the United States as free men. They visited the towns where they had once worked as laborers, shook hands with the families who had given them bread or water, and sometimes even embraced the guards who had once watched over them. These reunions were quiet, often emotional, and spoke of bonds that had somehow formed in the unlikeliest of places. For historians, the testimonies of these men became crucial in understanding the war. Their stories revealed not just military battles and political decisions, but human experiences that defied propaganda. They showed that even in the middle of total war, humanity could survive behind fences, in work fields, in small acts of kindness that changed lives forever. The legacy also touched their children and grandchildren. Many grew up hearing that America had been an enemy, but also a place of unexpected fairness. This complex memory influenced how Germans viewed America in the post-war era, not just as a military power, but as a society that had treated even its captives with dignity. In this way, the comparison between German and American prison life became part of a larger cultural memory, shaping transatlantic relations in ways that extended far beyond the war itself. In the end, the story of German POWs in America was not only about survival. It was about transformation. Men who had once believed in absolute loyalty to a brutal system discovered that another system, one based on fairness and law, could exist, even for prisoners. This realization did not erase their guilt, their losses, or their pain. But it gave them a perspective that endured long after the fences came down. Decades later, many would say that the most powerful lesson of their captivity was simple, that even in war, the way you treat a prisoner reveals the true character of a nation. For German soldiers who had lived through both systems, the comparison was unforgettable. In Germany, prison had been fear. In America, prison had been fairness. And that memory shaped not only their own lives, but the future of their country. The story of German prisoners of war in America is one of the strangest paradoxes of the Second World War. They entered captivity expecting brutality. They had been told that the enemy would humiliate them, starve them, and break them. Instead, many discovered that their lives behind barbed wire were more secure, more dignified, and even more hopeful than the lives of their own families back in Germany. This realization never truly left them. It haunted their thoughts as they stood in breadlines in ruined German cities. It shaped their reflections when they spoke to their children decades later. It surfaced in memoirs, interviews, and quiet reunions with former guards. The prison life comparison was not simply about comfort. It was about the difference between two systems, two ways of treating human beings. Inside Germany, prison was punishment. Fear, hunger, humiliation, and suspicion defined every corner of captivity. Men feared their own officers more than their enemies. Prisoners were often left without dignity, reduced to nothing more than bodies under watch. Inside America, prison was still captivity, but it was captivity with rules, order, and fairness. Men were given books, food, and opportunities to work. They could play soccer, paint, or learn English. They were watched, yes, but not dehumanized. It was this difference, the preservation of dignity, that struck them most deeply. For many German POWs, this became the sharpest lesson of their lives. They had fought for a regime that promised greatness through fear and violence. They were defeated by a nation that showed strength through fairness and law. In that contrast, they saw something that changed the way they thought about power, about freedom, and about the future. And yet, the memory was complicated. To admit that American prison life had been humane was also to admit that their own nation had failed them, not only on the battlefield, but in the way it treated its own people. Some prisoners carried this realization silently, ashamed to speak it aloud. Others spoke of it freely, using it as proof that dignity was possible even in times of war. This comparison stretched across decades. It lived in the memories of former soldiers, in the stories they told at family tables, in the quiet respect they felt for the country that had once held them captive. It lived in the journeys of those who returned to America later in life, seeking out the farms where they had worked, or the people who had once looked them in the eye and treated them as men rather than enemies. Historians, too, saw the significance. The testimonies of these POWs revealed something larger than the war itself. They revealed that even in the bloodiest conflict in history, humanity could survive. It could survive in the act of giving a prisoner a book. It could survive in the laughter of a soccer match behind barbed wire. It could survive in a meal served fairly to an enemy soldier. And that humanity mattered, not only in the moment, but for generations afterward. For the prisoners themselves, the memory was personal. Many carried it as a secret gratitude, a quiet respect for the nation that had once been their enemy. Some described their captivity as a turning point in their lives. Others admitted that they had learned more about democracy and fairness in an American camp than they had ever known in their own homeland. For them, the comparison was not just about two prison systems. It was about two ways of living, two visions of what society could be. This is why the story of German POWs in America still matters today. It is not just a piece of history. It is a reminder that the way a nation treats its prisoners speaks volumes about its character. It is proof that even in war, when hatred and fear seem to dominate, the choice to preserve dignity can leave an impact that lasts for a lifetime. The men who lived through this comparison are gone now. Their camps have been dismantled, their fences torn down, their watchtowers reduced to memory. But the lessons they carried remain. They remind us that power can be shown not only through weapons, but through fairness. That strength can be measured not only in victories, but in dignity. That even in the darkest times, humanity is a force stronger than hate. In the end, the prison life comparison between Germany and the United States during World War II is more than a historical curiosity. It is a story of human resilience, of lessons learned in captivity, of the surprising ways enemies can reveal truths about one another. For the men who lived it, it was unforgettable. For us, it remains a powerful reminder of what it means to be human, even behind barbed wire. Now that you've seen the prison life comparison between Germany and America, what do you think? Which part surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to America Talk for more powerful history stories.